First of all, many thanks to the Niagara Foundation for sponsoring this annual dinner, which brings together people of faith, people who are Muslims, Jews, or Christians. Particularly thanks are due to the Niagara Foundation for, through this dinner and other events, promoting the dignity of the human person as well as the common good. Also, many thanks to Father Bernie Riley and Cathedral Parish for welcoming us all here today. I also extend my appreciation to my colleagues here present, Imam Ahmad Salih of the University of Detroit, Mercy, and Rabbi Amy Bigman from the Congregation Sherazadeh. It's good to be with you. In April of this past year, the Jesuit Islamic scholar, Father Patrick Ryan of Fordham University, gave a talk on the faith of Abraham, bond or barrier. At the beginning of my remarks, I will start with some of his points as I culled them from his paper. We all revere Abraham. We Jews, Christians, Muslims. Even if not in the same way, or even if not for the same reasons. None of us, however, view Abraham as the real salvific source of our communities. That's important to know. For Jews, that would be the freedom from slavery in Egypt. For Christians, that would be the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. For Muslims, that would be the revelation of God through Muhammad. So what is it in Abraham that we all revere? It has something to do with origination. For Jews, it is the genetic origins of a people. For Christians, it is the spiritual origins of a faith people. For Muslims, it is the origins of monotheism. With so much difference, what really do we have in common here, especially since the banner which gathers us here this evening is Abrahamic traditions? Father Ryan would say that it is that Abraham was a human being uniquely in dialogue with one God alone. Ryan points out that the one story all three of our religious traditions share about Abraham is his willingness to sacrifice his son at God's command. This has always been one of my favorite textual accounts. In fact, way back in the study of theology, way back in the study of theology, too many years ago now, I did a major paper on this text from the book of Genesis. One element which I will not talk about, which has intrigued me from the traditional interpretation of this text, is its localization at the high point of the city of Jerusalem, a place revered by Jews, Christians, and Muslims. In this account of Abraham's sacrifice, it is not the son being sacrificed which draws my focus tonight, especially since our traditions do not agree on which son that was. And the Quran does not make that clear either. Rather, I want to focus on Abraham himself and his obedience to God. So Abraham, it seems to me, is presented to us in this text as one in a unique dialogue with God, and two, in a life of obedience to this God. It is in these two ways that Abraham really can be called the father of faith for every one of us. He defines faith, as it were, as being in communion with God and being faithful to God. As I now bend these few thoughts to the topic for this evening, altruism and compassion during times of hardship, I would like to draw three brief conclusions from this story, from our Father in faith, that may guide us. First of all, our care for our neighbor is ultimately a direction outward, where our focus is not on ourselves, not on what I might get out of this, but truly focused on the other. Abraham's life is the model for this behavior, since his life was completely focused on the other, God. There can be no communion, no compassion, unless such an other focus is at the heart of who we are and what we do. And so our Father in faith challenges us to move ourselves out of the center position and put the other there. If we can do this with God, we can do this with our neighbor. And if we can do this with our neighbor, we can do this with God. God and our neighbor can be put at the heart, the center. A second conclusion. The sacrifice called for by God of Abraham's son was a sacrifice not just of his son's flesh and blood, not just of someone else's flesh and blood. It was, in fact, the deepest sacrifice of Abraham himself, the deepest sacrifice that he could make of himself. It meant sacrificing his dreams, his hopes, his all, even sacrificing his concept of God, as he had previously experienced God. Here had been God who was a God of promise. And what was he demanding of him now? Kill the promise. Yet, that is the nature of being in dialogue with the one God. To be in communion with this God is to know that it is God's will which matters, and not my own. And not even my limited understanding of God's will. I am here to sacrifice myself for this other. Again, this helps us to define our altruism, our compassion. Unless our altruism and compassion involves the very sacrifice of ourselves, our behavior is not worthy to be called altruism and compassion, at least if we are to be sons and daughters of Abraham. Thirdly, third conclusion, this behavior on our part is always an act of obedience, the obedience of faith. I will often point out to people that we humans are mighty strange. Think about this. If we see an old person ready to step in front of a charging bus, we intervene to save that person, oftentimes at risk to ourselves. Why on earth do we do that? That doesn't fit the notion of survival of the fittest, according to Charles Darwin. I mean, if they're dumb enough to walk in front of a bus, they should be killed. Cleanse the tribe, you know. But that's not the way we react. That's not the way we are. It's one of the great challenges to Darwin's understanding. Rather, it points to something deeply embedded in our humanity, an innate desire to help, to love the other, even if there is no advantage to me or to the tribe. One might even be tempted to call it at times irrational. Perhaps it can be said that this common strain found in most human beings, all of us at some degree or another, has been planted in our nature by God. We are being obedient to God when we make such a sacrifice of ourselves for the other, with no consideration of the value to ourselves. Parents know what this is like, as you sacrifice yourself for your kids and you do anything for them. Just as we are all made of the same stardust, just as those energy factories in our cells, those mitochondria, point to a common Eve, just as those Y chromosomes seem to point to a common Adam, so are we all one in this inheritance from God, a willingness to sacrifice ourselves. Abraham did this. He shared that with us, and as a sign of that common inheritance, as he was completely willing to abandon himself for the other, the God in whom he placed his all. That demands of each of us the obedience of faith. My sisters and brothers here present, it is from that obedience of faith that we know our duty to care for all of our sisters and brothers, because that is the will of God. Thank you.